All right, guys, we are back here at the table saw, and I want to take a look at a couple of different cuts that we're going to make on our primary table saw machine. So the first is going to just be a straight rip cut. Again, that rip cut is making a cut parallel with the grain, the length of the board. This is how we are setting our width. We rip boards down to the width that we want them to be at. So we'll take a look at a rip cut. We'll take a look at a bevel cut where we're actually changing the angle of the blade and getting a nice beveled angle coming down the edge of our board. And then we'll also take a look at using the miter gauge to make a miter cut. So those are the three cuts we're going to take a look at. So first we're going to take a look at our rip cut. And as we know, the first thing that we're going to do is we are going to use our air hose to clean our machine off. Next, we need to set the blade height. So this is the board that I'm cutting through. So I'm going to just set it adjacent to the blade, and then I'm going to raise the blade up until the gullets are above the top of the material, right about there. Once I've got that set, I need to set my rip fence to the correct width. I want to cut this board down to a finished width of 5 inches, which means my rough width that I'm going to cut it to is going to be 5 1/16. And so I'm going to align on the right-hand side of the fence because my fence is on the right-hand side of the blade. I'm going to align the red line with 5 1/16. Next, I've got my jointed face and my jointed edge. So my jointed face goes down on the table and my jointed edge goes up against the fence. And then just by looking, I can see I'm not going to be able to keep my hand more than 4 inches away from this blade if I just run this through. So I have to use a push stick. And I'm going to get that from the bottom drawer of the cabinet under the extension table. So I've got my push stick here, and I'm going to just hook it on like this. And as I make my cut, I'm pushing down onto the table and into the fence. And it's really important that when I finish my cut, I finish all the way through so that the back end of my piece clears the back end of the blade. So I need to turn on the machine and let it cycle through its startup functions down here. I'm waiting for my solid green light. It takes a couple of seconds for this to happen. There we go. I've got solid green. So I've got my board backed up away from the blade. I've got my push stick ready right here. I'm going to pull out on the paddle switch to turn on the blade. And then standing on the blade side of the fence, like we've talked about, I'm going to run this through. I'm going to take my push stick. Pressure is down onto the table and to the right into the fence. And my left hand is going to stay back. It's not actually going to do anything while I'm making this cut. I'm going to finish my cut and push my piece all the way through. And then I'm going to push the stop button, and I'm going to wait until the blade comes to a complete stop before I clear anything away. And that is my process for making a rip cut. And if I check my width with my tape measure now, I am right at 5 1/16 where I want to be. Next, let's take a look at making a bevel cut. I want to cut a 30-degree bevel or angle all the way along the edge of this board. So the first thing I need to do is I need to clean the machine. So I've got my air hose, and my machine is clean. The next thing I need to do is I need to set the angle of the blade. And to do that, I'm going to power off the machine, and I'm going to unplug because I'm going to put my hands on this blade. Now I'm going to raise the blade up out of the table. And in the top drawer of our cabinet here, we have a small digital angle gauge. So I'm going to turn this on. I'm going to set it on the table, and I'm going to push the 0 button. And now it's reading 0. Now I can take this, and it's magnetic. I'm going to stick it on the edge of the blade, and it's currently reading exactly 90 degrees. I said I want to cut a 30-degree bevel, so from 90, I need to bring this angle all the way down to 60 degrees. 60.2, 60.0 right there. So that is the angle that I want to set this at. And now I can remove this, turn it off, and put it back in the drawer. Now that I've got my angle set, I'm going to adjust my blade height. I'm going to do it the same way so that the gullets are protruding above the surface of my workpiece. Right there. And now I'm going to set my rip fence. My last cut was to 5 1/16. I'm going to cut this on the skinny edge at the bottom to 4 1/2. So I'm going to set my fence to 4 1/2 inches right here. And now I'm ready to make my cut. So I've got to plug back in. And again, this plug plugs in, and then it rotates just a little to lock it. I can power the machine on, wait for it to run through its startup cycle. Solid green and blinking red. Now it's ready. I've got my push stick ready. So I'm going to turn on the machine. And again, pushing down and into the fence, I'm going to make this bevel cut. Clear my workpiece past the back end of the blade. Turn off the saw and wait for it to come to a complete stop. Now I can retrieve my pieces. My cutoff goes into the trash can. I grab my air hose and clean. And you can see that I've got a nice 30-degree bevel cut on the edge of my board, as opposed to a straight 90-degree cut. The last cut that I want to demonstrate for you guys today on this machine is a miter cut. So I've got my miter gauge here, and I've got it set to 15 degrees, which will work for this demonstration. To make changes to this, we're just going to unscrew this handle, and then this pivots back and forth. Now underneath, it has a couple of stops in place at some common angles. And I can pull this pin back, and that releases it and gives me access to the full spectrum of angles, 60 degrees in either direction. So I'm going to set this to 15 degrees. And I'm going to lock this handle off. And I'm going to set the miter gauge down into the miter slot on the machine. When we're making miter cuts, we will not typically need the rip fence. So I'm going to move this out of the way. I'm going to clean my machine, and I'm going to grab my workpiece that I want to use for this cut. So here's my workpiece. I need to set my blade height. Now, a miter cut is one of the few exceptions. You never want to make a freehand cut on the table saw like we've talked about. And this is not a freehand cut because I've got the miter gauge supporting my workpiece. But this is one of the few cuts where we're not going to use the rip fence. So I'm going to put both hands on my workpiece, squeezing it tight against the miter gauge, and I'm going to run my workpiece all the way through and then I'm going to stop the machine. So I've already run through the startup process. I'm going to turn the blade on with both hands squeezing tight against the miter gauge. I'm going to hold the piece tight and I'm going to run it through. And now I can remove that piece safely without touching the blade. I'm going to leave my little cutoff end there until the blade has come to a complete stop. There we go. Now I can remove this. This guy goes right into the trash can. And here you can see I've got a nice 15-degree miter cut along the end of my workpiece. I can now clean the machine. I'm going to return the miter gauge to its home underneath the table on the front of the machine. And now I'm finished and I can walk away. So those are our operating procedures at the table saw. I showed you 3 different cuts, a rip cut, a bevel cut, and a miter cut, so that you know how to set the machine up correctly when you need to make one of those cuts for one of your projects. Like I said, I'm going to have a second video showing work done at the other machine using our dado blades and making dado cuts and rabbet cuts and how to set those up correctly.